The first light of dawn barely touched the Cobb River when Claire Sullivan parked her rusty pickup truck on the shoulder of a dirt road. The fog that hung over the water was dense and impenetrable, as if it held secrets. She took a deep breath and looked around. "It's not that bad," she muttered to herself, trying to convince herself that this remote place would be a good refuge for her research. But something in the air felt wrong, as if nature was whispering warnings she couldn't understand. Claire was a marine biologist, transferred from Seattle after years of studying the effects of pollution on fish populations. His new mission, funded by an environmental organization, was to monitor changes in the ecosystem of the Cobb River, which runs through the small town of Ashland. With just over 1,000 inhabitants, the city was a world apart, surrounded by dense forests and a river that snaked like a pulsing vein. Arriving at the local boarding house, a Victorian house with peeling paint and creaky porches, Claire was greeted by Martha Hayes, the owner. Martha, a woman with white hair tied into a tight bun, seemed to be watching her more than necessary. His eyes were a deep blue, as if he saw through Claire. "You're the new scientist, aren't you?" asked Martha, as she handed him a rusty key. "Yes, I'm here to study the Cobb River. It seems like an incredible place." Claire tried to sound enthusiastic, but Martha's expression remained serious. "Just be careful. The river is not as hospitable as it seems." The elderly woman hesitated, as if reconsidering saying something. "At night, you will hear things. Don't listen." Claire smiled politely and went up to her room, attributing the warning to local superstitions. "I was used to dealing with skeptical locals and their stories to scare away outsiders. And before we continue with this intriguing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us bring more content like this to you. Now, let's get back to the story. That night, the biologist was organizing her measuring equipment when she heard the sound, a low, continuous cry coming from far away, but which seemed to get closer every minute. Claire froze. Could it be an animal, an echo of the river? When he opened the window to hear better, he felt a shiver when he realized that the sound seemed human. It must be the wind, that's all. Claire closed the window tightly, trying to ignore the chill. The next day, while collecting samples on the riverbank, he found Martha fishing alone in a small boat. The woman looked like a part of the scenery, as if she had always been there. When he saw Claire, he shook his head and paddled to shore. "The river doesn't like to be disturbed, dear. He remembers—" Martha hesitated again. "Remember what?" Claire asked, leaning in to hear better. "Of things that should have been forgotten." The answer came darkly, almost like a whisper. Claire decided not to insist. However, as he advanced along the bank, he noticed something strange. Small marks on the ground, as if something with long, thin fingers had scratched the earth. Probably an animal, he thought, but the idea didn't seem so convincing. The marks were too deep, too precise. The following nights brought more of the crying. It was always the same sound. A female voice, suffering, echoing through the water. Claire began recording the sounds, determined to find a scientific explanation. But when he presented the audios to Jack Larson, a local fisherman he had befriended, he turned pale. "That's the river woman, Claire. You need to stop this." "Oh, what's his wife?" Claire asked, confused. "He's a legend here. They say that many years ago a woman lost her children in the river. She went into the water to save them, but never came back. Now she wanders here, crying for them. And your children—" Jack paused, swallowing hard. "They didn't die as we thought. They became something more." "Anything else?" Claire laughed, trying to hide her discomfort. "That sounds like a story to scare children." Jack didn't respond. He just grabbed his belongings and left, leaving Claire alone by the river. One night, unable to resist her curiosity, Claire decided to follow the sound. He equipped himself with a flashlight and waterproof boots and headed out towards the banks. The crying was louder than ever, almost as if calling her. Walking through the forest that bordered the river, he tripped over something. When he illuminated the floor, he saw an old, soggy rag doll. its face almost erased by time. That's when he felt movement in the water. Something was watching her, something big, motionless, but alive. Claire took a step back, her heart racing. Suddenly the crying stopped. The silence was deafening. At the bottom, a figure slowly emerged, a skeletal body covered in algae, with eyes that glowed like two lanterns in the darkness. She didn't have time to react before something cold and slimy grabbed her ankle, pulling her towards the shore. On the bank of the Cobb River, Claire Sullivan fought against something invisible that was squeezing her ankle with inhuman strength. Her scream cut through the silence of the night, but no one was around to hear her. The flashlight fell from his hands and rolled, briefly illuminating what appeared to be a thin, pale hand emerging from the water. With a desperate effort, Claire managed to free herself, falling backwards into the mud. Her breathing came in uncontrolled gasps as she crawled away from the water. The river, now calm as if nothing had happened, reflected the full moon, a brutal contrast to the terror he had just experienced. Back at the boarding house, Claire was wet, dirty, and shaking. Martha, who had been awakened by the sound of the door opening violently, appeared at the top of the stairs. "You heard, didn't you?" asked Martha without surprise. Claire, still out of breath, just nodded. "It's not just listening. I saw something. Something pulled me." His voice was a mix of disbelief and panic. Martha sighed deeply and walked down the stairs calmly, as if she had been waiting for that moment. "That's why no one here goes to the river at night. There are things there that no longer belong to this world." She stopped for a moment, assessing Claire with a hard look. "You need to get out of here while you still can." But Claire wasn't the type to shy away from mysteries. Even though she was scared, she felt compelled to understand what was happening. She refused to believe there was no rational explanation. If these things are real, then they have to be explained. "Everything has a logic, Martha. I'll find out what's going on." Martha shook her head in frustration. "You don't understand, girl. It's not something that can be explained. It's something that needs to be respected." The next day, Claire looked for Jack, found him on the pier, mending a fishing net. He hesitated to look at her as she approached, but when he noticed her expression, he dropped what he was doing. "You went to the river at night, didn't you?" he asked, his voice heavy with disapproval. "I saw something, Jack. Something that looked human, but wasn't." Claire trembled as she spoke. "You have to tell me what you know." Jack wiped his hands on his pants and sighed. "More than a century ago, a woman named Eliza lived here. They say she was married to a cruel man who drank too much and treated her even worse. One day, he accused her of treason and, in a fit of anger, threw the children into the river. Eliza threw herself after them, but none of them returned." Jack paused, looking at the river as if he could see the ghosts of the past. "The story goes that her children didn't drown like everyone thought. The river took them. He transformed them into something that guards their shores, protecting Eliza's spirit, who still wanders looking for them." Claire crossed her arms, trying to rationalize what she was hearing. "And you believe that? That the river turned her children into monsters?" Jack looked at her with a seriousness that made her shudder. "I don't need to believe it. I've seen the marks they leave. I've heard the crying." Determined to find more answers, Claire visited the town's small museum, run by an elderly man named Harold. The place was full of antique objects and black and white photographs that told the story of Ashland. When he mentioned the name Eliza, Harold immediately tensed up. "Don't say her name out loud, girl. There are things we'd rather forget around here." "But I need to know. What happened to her? And with the children?" Claire insisted. Harold scratched his grey beard reluctantly, but eventually relented. He pulled out a faded photograph of a stern-faced woman with two small boys at her side. "That's all that's left of her. The house where he lived was destroyed, and the river took the rest. They say that when she's not crying, she's calling for help, but those who respond are never seen again." That night, Claire was in her room, examining the marks on her ankle. The purple stains looked like finger marks, but they were too long and thin to be human. As he watched, he heard a familiar sound, crying, louder than ever. She grabbed her flashlight and recorder, determined to record more concrete evidence. She walked to the river again, but this time she took a rope and a pocket knife with her in case something tried to pull her back. When he reached the shore, crying seemed to be everywhere. The water glowed with a strange silvery reflection, and in the middle of the river, a figure began to emerge. It was a woman with long, tangled hair, wearing what looked like a torn white dress. His eyes were fixed on Claire, emotionless but full of pain. Claire stood still, with the recorder in her hand capturing every sound. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice wavering. The figure did not respond, but raised a thin arm, pointing towards the water. Then two small silhouettes appeared at her side, smaller and darker, with glowing eyes that seemed to bore into Claire's soul. That's when the woman started walking toward the shore, and the children, or whatever they were, started crawling after her, leaving tracks in the water that seemed to shine in the moonlight. Claire took a step back, her heart beating like a drum. The recorder slipped from his hands, falling into the mud. And then she realized that she was not just being watched, but hunted. Claire ran along the riverbank, tripping over rocks and branches as the darkness seemed to swallow her. Behind her, the sounds were deafening, wet, uneven footsteps, crying mixed with childish laughter that echoed like a nightmare. The flashlight in her hand shook as she tried to light her way, but the beam of light seemed to be swallowed by the thick fog. She stopped to catch her breath, hiding behind a fallen tree. The sudden silence was scarier than the sounds that chased her. Then, from the other side of the tree, a soft, trembling voice cut through the air. "Don't run away from me. I just want my children back." Claire turned slowly, her breath bated. There was the woman closer than she expected, her deep-set eyes glowing with an unearthly light. His face was pale, almost translucent, as if it were made of mist, and in his expression there was a mixture of despair and fury. "They don't belong to you," the woman whispered, her voice breaking at the end. Claire tried to back away, but tripped and fell. The woman did not advance. Instead, he extended his thin hand, as if begging for something. "What do you want from me?" Claire asked, panic evident in her voice. "Justice." The answer was simple, but full of pain. "They took everything from me, and now they too must feel the loss." Before Claire could respond, the smaller creatures appeared beside the woman. Their shapes were clearer now. Thin, almost skeletal bodies covered in a slimy substance. His eyes had no pupils, just glowing sockets that seemed to devour everything they looked at. Claire realized that those things weren't just the transformed children, but something darker, something corrupted by the river and that woman's pain. The next day, Claire told Jack everything, who, despite being visibly shaken, agreed to help her. They decided to explore the old land where Eliza's house stood, looking for any clue that could explain or solve the mystery. They arrived at the place at dusk. What was left of the house were just overgrown foundations and an ancient stone with inscriptions on it that Jack explained was part of a forgotten indigenous ritual. "That was sacred," Jack said, running his fingers over the worn marks. The colonists moved where they shouldn't have, and the river was never the same again. Claire analyzed the application carefully and took photos. Later, researching in the town's small museum, she found documents that explained the ritual, a protective spell that connected the life of the river with the land around it. When colonizers destroyed the site, the connection was broken, leaving the river vulnerable to disturbed spirits. Claire and Jack came up with a plan. They would use the museum's records to recreate the ritual and restore peace to the river. But there was one crucial detail. The ritual required a sacrifice. Jack objected immediately. "You can't be serious, Claire. This is crazy." "We have no other choice. If we continue to ignore this, more people will disappear." Despite Jack's reservations, Claire was determined. They collected the necessary materials and arranged to perform the ritual at midnight. on the bank where the sounds were loudest. That night, as they set up the improvised altar, the crying began again, getting closer and closer. Claire recited the ancient words while Jack kept the creatures at bay with a makeshift torch. The fire seemed to repel things, but not for long. Suddenly, Eliza appeared. His eyes were fixed on Claire, but there was something different. She no longer looked like a victim. His presence was menacing, as if the wrath of centuries was ready to explode. "You won't take them away from me," she shouted, as the waters of the river shook violently. Jack was dragged by one of the creatures while trying to protect Claire. Her scream of pain echoed through the forest, but Claire couldn't stop. She finished the last line of the spell, casting the ritual artifact into the waters. For a moment, the river was completely silent. The moon reflected in the water looked brighter than ever. Then everything fell apart. The creatures began to scream, an agonizing sound that made Claire cover her ears. The woman at the center of it all, Eliza, fell to her knees, screaming for her children as the waters swallowed them again. But something went wrong. The connection with the river has not been re-established. Instead, the dark forces seemed to rage even more. The earth began to shake, and the waters of the river rose like a tsunami. Claire was swept away by the current, swallowed by the darkness of the Cobb River, as she heard Jack's screams fade away. His last vision was of Eliza, standing on the banks, crying as the river took her once again. The silence on the Cobb River seemed eternal. The water, once turbulent, now rested calm and eerie under the moonlight, as if satisfied with what it had taken. Jack had disappeared, carried away by the creatures or the force of the river, and Claire found herself alone on a distant bank, coughing up water and struggling to catch her breath. His mind was in pieces, but a single truth echoed in his head. The ritual had failed. As he tried to get up, his eyes caught something on the bank. The artifact he had used in the ritual was partially buried in the mud, but it looked different. The inscriptions that once glowed had disappeared, leaving only a smooth, cold surface. She picked it up, feeling cold hopelessness seep into her heart. Something is very wrong, he thought. Claire managed to return to the city in the early hours of the morning, shaky and exhausted. Martha was on the boarding house's porch, smoking a cigarette, something Claire had never seen her do before. When she saw her, Martha's expression went from concern to pure terror. "You tried, didn't you?" Martha asked, her voice low and full of reproach. I just wanted to help. The things I saw weren't human. I needed to do something," Claire replied, trying to justify her actions. Martha stubbed out her cigarette against the banister. "You messed with something you don't understand, girl. Now it's too late." Claire tried to explain about the ritual and what had happened, but Martha interrupted. "Eliza and the children are not the problem. They are victims as much as anyone. What you faced in the river is much older. They are just a reflection of what lives below." Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. "What lives down there?" Martha hesitated before answering. "The Cobb River is a place of sacrifice. It always was. First by the ancient people, then by the colonists, and now by us. Whatever is there needs to be fed. When you tried to stop it, well, I think you've seen the result. Determination and guilt consumed Claire. She couldn't just leave things as they were. But with Jack missing and Martha's resistance, she knew she would need help. He remembered Harold, the museum curator, and went to him at dawn. Harold was reluctant to open the door when Claire knocked, but upon seeing her, he relented. The old man seemed more tired than the day before, as if the weight of the river's history was also weighing on him. "You've seen what really lives in that river, haven't you?" Harold asked bluntly. Claire confirmed with a nod. "I need to understand how to stop this. I can't let more people suffer." Harold sighed and pulled an old book from a dusty shelf. "To stop? Can't stop. You can only bargain." He explained that the ritual performed by Claire did not have enough power to restore balance because it was missing the essential component, a willing sacrifice. Something or someone needed to offer themselves to the river. "That's why no one tries anymore, girl. No one is willing to pay the price. Harold's words reverberated in Claire's mind as she returned to the river. Her thoughts were cloudy, and memories of Jack being taken tormented her. She refused to accept that he and so many others had died in vain. When he reached the shore, the artifact in his hands seemed to pulse as if it were alive. Suddenly, Eliza's figure appeared again, this time without her children. She was alone, more ethereal than before, almost dissolving into the mist that danced over the water. "You're back. Why?" Eliza asked, her voice now softer but still filled with sadness. "I want to end this. I don't want anyone else to suffer like you," Claire replied, with her eyes fixed on the spirit. Eliza tilted her head, assessing her. "Are you willing to give what the river demands?" Silence fell between the two as the water around them seemed to grow thicker and darker. Claire knew what Eliza meant. The river needed a real sacrifice, something pure and deliberate. Couldn't there be another way? Claire asked, her voice shaking. Eliza just shook her head slowly. Claire spent hours sitting by the river, contemplating the choice before her. She could leave, as Martha suggested, and let the river continue its uncontrollable hunger. Or he could give himself up, believing that his life could mean the end of that cycle of destruction. As the sun set, Claire made her choice. He left the artifact on the bank, with a message scrawled on a piece of paper that said, "To anyone who encounters this, remember that the river is not an enemy. It is a reminder of everything we took without giving anything in return." She walked into the water, feeling the cold envelop her ankles, then her knees. Eliza's voice echoed in the current, singing a low, mesmerizing melody. Claire took one last look at the forest behind her before disappearing beneath the waters. The Cobb River seemed to have returned to tranquility. The waters, which had once roared as if they were alive, now flowed smoothly under the silver light of the moon. The creatures, once so present, had disappeared. Silence dominated the banks, and the surrounding forest seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid to disturb the newly restored calm. Claire Sullivan had disappeared, just like so many others before her, but unlike the previous victims, there was something different in the air. Her sacrifice was not in vain. The next morning, Ashland residents noticed subtle changes. The crying, which had become part of the Cobb River's identity, no longer echoed. Martha, waking up and looking at the river from her balcony, felt an unsettling peace. It was as if the place was asleep. However, at the guest house, Harold, who was reading the message left by Claire next to the artifact, felt a tightness in his chest. He knew what that meant. Contrary to what many believed, sacrifices like Claire's were not final. They were pauses. A cycle, temporarily interrupted but destined to start again. "There is no victory here, just more time," Harold muttered as he closed the paper and put the artifact back in the museum. That same night, Martha was awakened by a familiar sound. It wasn't the cry of the river, but something softer, like a whisper. She got up and walked to the window. Outside, on the bank, he saw a silhouette he recognized immediately. Claire. "That's not possible," Martha whispered to herself, squeezing the crucifix around her neck. Claire was standing in knee-deep water looking at Martha. His eyes shone with an ethereal light, and his face, although serene, carried something otherworldly. Without saying a word, Claire raised a hand and pointed at the river, as if to warn Martha about something. Martha closed the curtains but couldn't sleep. Deep down, she knew that the river still held secrets. And now, Claire was part of it. Over the next few weeks, locals began to tell stories about a new figure in the river. Unlike Eliza, Claire didn't cry. Instead, she was described as a protector, a figure who silently watched fishermen and those who approached the water. Jack, who many believed to be dead, mysteriously reappeared in the city. He was dehydrated and had deep cuts, but alive. When asked, he said he only remembered one thing: Claire, standing in the river, telling him to go away. "She saved me. I don't know how, but she brought me back." He said it, but no one seemed to believe it. At the museum, Harold received an anonymous letter. Inside was a small piece of wet fabric and a note with smudged letters. The river rests, but it never forgets. Protect it, or it will take more than ever before. Harold, now with the artifact kept secret, began to live as the guardian of a memory that few would understand. Months later, a group of engineers arrived in Ashland with plans to build a dam on the Cobb River. When the news spread, Martha knew the cycle was about to begin again. Despite residents' protests, the machines arrived and began working. The first night after construction began, the crying returned. This time, it wasn't just a lament, it was a scream, a sound that not only echoed across the river but throughout the entire city, reverberating in the hearts of everyone who heard it. And when Harold was found dead in his museum, with the artifact missing, everyone knew that Claire's sacrifice had been in vain. The construction of the dam on the Cobb River transformed the place into a field of tension. The incessant sound of machinery mixed with the increasingly deafening wail that echoed in the night. No logical explanation could contain the growing fear that spread among the workers and residents of Ashland. The river, now rebellious, seemed alive, as if protesting against the changes that were being imposed on it. Jack, still recovering from his injuries, tried to organize the residents to stop the works, but the engineers and investors were adamant. "It's progress," they said. "Superstitions will not stop development." Martha, in desperation, was the last to visit the river before access was closed by the security team. That night, she lit a candle and called out to Claire, but the only response she received was the cold wind that hissed like a whisper of warning. The next morning, the tragedy began. One of the workers disappeared while inspecting the bank. His helmet was found floating in the river, but there was no sign of his body. At dusk, the screams began, voices that seemed to come from within the waters, calling names, begging for help. Engineers reported that machines began to fail inexplicably. New parts broke as if they were made of paper, and steel cables broke for no apparent reason. The construction manager, a skeptical man named Mark Turner, attributed everything to wear and tear and ignored warnings from locals. On the third night, the river overflowed its banks. The waters, previously confined, advanced with devastating force, invading the workers' camp. Some escaped, but many were not seen again. Martha, Jack, and other residents watched the scene from afar, on a hill overlooking the river. The waters churned unnaturally, swirling in whirlpools that looked like giant eyes, watching the intruders. At the center of it all, a figure emerged. Claire. She was standing on the water like a sentry, her eyes shining in a way that no one could mistake for humanity. In his presence, the crying stopped, replaced by an overwhelming silence. Claire looked at the crowd on the hill, fixing her gaze on Martha and Jack. "I warned you." His voice echoed, not in sound, but in the mind of every person there. Suddenly the water began to recede, taking with it the debris of the dam and any remains of the construction. Within minutes, everything was gone, and the river seemed calmer than ever, but no one was mistaken. There was a latent threat in that tranquility. The bodies of the missing workers were never found. The company responsible abandoned the project and declared bankruptcy, while stories about what happened in Ashland began to spread. The city has become a feared place, avoided even by curious tourists. Jack, consumed with guilt over not having done more to save Claire, left Ashland shortly afterwards. Martha, in turn, remained, but her health rapidly deteriorated. Before he died, he wrote a letter, leaving a warning for anyone who came after. "The Cobb River does not belong to us. It is a reminder that there are forces greater than we can understand. Respect it or pay the price." Decades have passed since the events that turned the Cobb River into a legend. Ashland, once a bustling small town, was now a place forgotten by time. The roads that led to the river were covered in vegetation, and the signs indicating its location had disappeared, as if nature itself was trying to erase the existence of that place. Yet residents of neighboring towns still talked about Ashland, the river, and the woman who sacrificed everything to protect them. For some, Claire Sullivan was a martyr, a hero. To others, a fool who defied forces beyond her understanding. In the fall of a particularly cold year, a man appeared at Ashland's old museum, now a dust-covered ruin. He was young, perhaps in his 30s, with a thoughtful countenance and eyes that carried an unsettling determination. In her hands was an old diary with worn edges and the name Claire Sullivan engraved on the cover. He found the diary at a garage sale in Seattle, and the words inside had led him there. Entire pages described Claire's obsession with understanding the river, her theories about sacrifice, and the forces that inhabited it. Among the scientific notes were personal reflections that revealed the growing fear and loneliness that consumed her in the days before her final decision. The man, named Daniel, was a geologist and had heard about the legends of the Cobb River while studying anomalies in bodies of water in the United States. He believed there might be something in the river, not supernatural, but some kind of unique natural phenomenon that explained the deaths and disappearances. Daniel spent weeks exploring Ashland, gathering information from elderly residents who still remembered the events. It was in a small cabin on the outskirts that he found the last living witness, a man named Jack. Jack, now in his 70s, lived in isolation, but was still tormented by nightmares of his experiences. He was reluctant to talk to Daniel, but when he saw Claire's diary, something changed. "I didn't want her to go. I tried to stop her. But Claire—" Jack paused, his eyes teary. "She believed she could change everything. That could save us all." Jack told Daniel everything he knew, including details about the ritual and the forces that seemed to control the river. "It's not the waters, it's what's beneath them, something that awakens when disturbed." Daniel was intrigued by Jack's words and decided to investigate the riverbanks. When Daniel arrived at Cobb, he was greeted by the same crushing silence that Claire had described in her diary. The dense fog felt alive, enveloping him like a cloak. He installed equipment to measure the composition of the water, but it was during the first night that he realized the true danger. As he adjusted a motion detector near the shore, he heard the sound the stories mentioned, crying. It was not just a sound, but something that seemed to penetrate his mind, evoking memories he didn't want to revisit. Looking at the river, he saw something that paralyzed him. One figure was there, partially submerged in the water. She was a woman, or at least seemed to be. His eyes shone in the darkness, and his face was fixed in Daniel. "You came back," he whispered, a voice in his soft, familiar mind. Daniel could not react. The cry has become higher, now mixed with other voices, more serious and disturbing. He fell to his knees, his hands covering his ears as the river seemed to call him. When Daniel returned to him, he was lying on the bank. "I didn't know how long it had passed, but something in your mind had changed." He began to connect the information he had gathered with the words of Claire's diary, and concluded that the river was not just a place of sacrifice. It was a portal, a connection between the physical world and something beyond. Before leaving, Daniel left a message recorded on his recorder. "The Cobb River is not just a river, it is a border, a place where pain and repentance manifest themselves as tangible forces, and those who get too close are in danger of being consumed for it." In the following years, reports of the river began to emerge again. Backpacks disappeared, and fishermen spoke of distant figures, watching them in the fog. Choro echoed again, not only on the banks, but also in the dreams of the residents of neighboring cities. Ashland became a living legend, a place that symbolized the cost of moving forces beyond human understanding. Claire Sullivan, now a myth among those who dared to study the river, became an inseparable part of its history, a figure that protected and warned, but was also a memory of the price of sacrifice, and the river, patient and unchanging, waited. For in the end, all who approached him inevitably responded to his call. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We love to know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our work. See you in the next video.